final performance is by Jonathon Arens, and Jonathon will be giving his state championship speech, which is a persuasive speech. As a matter of fact, there are only 2 people invited per state to attend the interstate oratorical contest, in which Jonathon was invited because of winning state championship. The interstate oratorical contest is 151 years old. It began in 1874 as the oldest forensics tournament. So we are so thrilled that Jonathon has been invited to perform. We're going to give you a preview of his award-winning persuasive speech entitled Dark Chocolate, Child Labor and Slavery on the West African Coast. Please welcome Jonathon Arens back.
A Washington Post reporter walking through a cocoa farm in the dense forest came across a scrawny-looking teenager named Abu Traore. He appeared to be the oldest amongst a group of young boys. "How old are you?" the reporter asked, to which Traore replied, 19, in a hushed tone. But as his overseer turned away for just a moment, Traore traced a different number into the dirt. 15. He had come to the Ivory Coast from Burkina Faso in order to go to school, but Traore had been deceived. He hadn't been to school in 5 years. According to the 2024 U.S. Bureau of International Labor report, there are at least 1.5 million child laborers in Ghana and the Ivory Coast alone. These 2 countries make up 60% of global cocoa production. If we throw in Nigeria and Cameroon, we're talking about nearly 75% of global cocoa production and up to 2 million child laborers. This is one of the largest human rights crises on the planet today. To understand what is going on in the chocolate industry, what is going into the chocolate that we consume, well, we have to look at the scope and nature of the problem, and then examine the causes, and then finally, we'll find some solutions. Beginning with the problem, what is happening on these West African cocoa farms? Before we get to that, we do need to understand one thing. Child labor is a complicated issue. In many situations in impoverished countries, it is an understandable notion for a child to want to work to help their family. However, we are not talking about situations where a 17-year-old lies and says they're 18 in order to help put food on the table. The vast majority of these situations include either children far too young to be working, human trafficking, receiving absolutely no payment beyond scarce food and shelter, or some combination of those 3. With that being understood, we'll break this into 2, the workers and the work being done. Beginning with the workers, as the Food Empowerment Project reports in 2022, the vast majority of children on these farms are between the ages of 12 and 16. And reporters have found children working on farms as young as 5 years old. There's one village in Burkina Faso where nearly every single mother has had a child trafficked into another country for cocoa farming. Up to 40% of the workers on these farms are young girls, constantly at risk of sexual assault. A Humanium article from August of 2024 tells the story of reporters who went deep undercover and were approached by human traffickers, attempting to sell them children at a bargain rate of $34. This is an industry built on child labor and slavery. But now that we understand what the workforce looks like, what are the conditions of the work itself? Well, to put it simply, hell. It's important to understand that every one of the conditions I'm about to describe is not just a violation of international labor law, but the supposed labor laws of the countries themselves. 10 to 14-hour days constantly are the norm for any who are physically capable, and the overseers are quite loose with that qualifier. Some children are given chainsaws to clear the forest, but most are given machetes to cut the cacao pods from the trees. In fact, it would be harder to find a child not riddled with scars. As Ali Diabate, a formerly enslaved worker, said in the article, "Slavery, a Global Investigation," it took 2 people to put the bag of pods on my head. And if you didn't hurry, you were beaten. With chemicals now as the modern norm in agriculture, the National Opinion Research Center found that from 2010 to 2020, the number of children exposed to toxic chemicals on these farms increased from 15% to 50%. Of course, none of them are given protective clothing. A Harvard International review, as of December 2024, found that the average cocoa farmer makes as little as 78 cents per day, which is nearly 3 times below the World Bank's extreme poverty threshold. Many of the children, most especially the trafficked ones, will not ever receive a dime. Teresa, another formerly enslaved worker, was asked in the documentary Slavery, A Global Investigation as well, what he would say to someone who eats chocolate. Quote, "When you were eating chocolate, you were eating my flesh." What could possibly be the causes to warrant those conditions? Well, in economic terms, it's quite simple. Supply and demand. The supply in question is, of course, cocoa, used to make chocolate. Grandview Research estimated in 2024 that the global chocolate market is around $120 billion and is growing quite rapidly. People love chocolate. The demand is clear. But why does that demand warrant those conditions? Well, in this instance, it's greed and intentional ignorance. When we look at the actors in this situation, we have to split them into 2. The companies that need the cocoa and the countries that produce it. Beginning with the companies, there is a long history of the big chocolate companies like Hershey, Mars, Nestle, Godiva, fighting off these accusations of child slavery and horrific conditions. In fact, they've nearly all signed pledges to uproot it all from their supply chain by 2005, 2008, 2010, and on and on and on. An anonymous executive from one of the top companies was asked by a Washington Post reporter if he could guarantee that any of the products they made were without the use of child labor. Quote, "I cannot make those claims." But beyond the greed, there's a cop-out. There's an intentional ignorance. They don't know where the cocoa comes from. Mars, the maker of M&Ms, can only trace 24% of its cocoa supply back to the farm. Hershey, 40%. Nestle is the gold standard of these chocolate companies, these big chocolate companies, being able to trace 49% of its supply back to the source, meaning that over half of their cocoa just magically appears. They don't know where it comes from, and they really don't care to ask. But beyond the companies, we cannot let the countries where this is happening off the hook either. Why are they willing to kill journalists to prevent the spread of information about the industry, which they have? Well, because it's a bedrock of their nation's economies. The Observatory for Economic Complexity found that as of 2023, 30% of Ghana's exports and 40% of the Ivory Coast exports are cocoa. It's their bread and butter. Supply, demand. Now that we understand the problems and their causes, let's find some solutions. And there are 2 groups: the broad global solutions and the personal things that we can do in our day-to-day lives. The broadest action that must be taken is finally pushing these companies to understand where their cocoa comes from, pay their workers a fair wage, and end the cycle of child trafficking, labor, and slavery. We must push this on these countries as well. In fact, it's not unreasonable to fight for sanctions against these countries. Similar actions have been taken or proposed against the Democratic Republic of the Congo for their child labor concerns. That had to do with the cobalt mining industry used for tech and batteries. Unfortunately, however, many of these non-manufacturing areas with child labor are just overlooked. Sadly, the vast majority of the humanitarian economic actions that the U.S. takes are with the ulterior motive of harming another competing superpower like Russia or China. meaning that all the child labor issues that aren't inside of that sphere are just relegated to mass slavery. So it would not actually be that difficult to use sanctions, embargoes, boycotts, everybody's favorite new economic buzzword, tariffs, to pressure these countries into ending mass slavery. Maybe we can finally put the American economic hegemony to good use. But putting all of that aside, what are the personal things that we can do in our day-to-day lives? Well, the first thing, and though it may seem simple, perhaps the most important, is to research and understand and talk about this issue with family and friends. In a climate of war, chaos, and strife, the chocolate companies are hoping that this all slips through the cracks. We signed our pledges. You can go back to eating our chocolate and feeling fine. Well, no, we can't. And that's the next step. Hershey, Mars, Nestle, they don't have a monopoly on making chocolate. My recommendation is the organization Be Slavery Free. They work and publish a chocolate scorecard. In fact, you can go to chocolatescorecard.com to find grades on large, medium, and small companies, as well as retailers, on issues such as child labor, deforestation, trafficking, living income, and more. You will be saddened to see how many of the big chocolate companies fail to live up to the task. But you will find chocolate companies that produce good, ethical chocolate. It's my urge that you support these companies with your business. There's meaningful yet achievable action to be taken. Hit big chocolate in their pocketbooks. Might be the only thing that wakes them up. We do not know where Abu Traore is right now. In fact, we do not know if he is still alive. But what we do know is that there are literally millions of children like him right now swinging a machete and spraying dangerous chemicals, and it is up to all of us to try and stop it.